I just accidentally read 3 papers for a seminar that I wasn't supposed to read. So I decided, instead of being upset about my time wasted, I'll make a little video about the papers, or about the topics that the papers were discussing. Essentially, these papers were in the philosophy of psychiatry. And the topic they were trying to tackle was this boundary problem. Essentially, this boundary problem is the problem in the philosophy of psychiatry, asking how we decide when ordinary human experiences, when they become mental disorder, when do they become mental disorders? And so this obviously comes up whenever we're discussing overdiagnosis, which is a hot topic, or when we're discussing trying to expand the diagnostic criteria for reasons X, Y, or Z. And it also tags along when there's this worry that psychiatry is oftentimes medicalizing or pathologizing normal responses to difficult life events, but nothing that ought warrant a type of mental disorder label. And so the issue, or the discussion, is centered around, well, what grounds the distinction between a disorder and a non-disorder? And this is very, very important for philosophically inclined psychiatrists and just like the population as a whole. Essentially, the common worry in these papers that I was reading was that the diagnostic criteria are oftentimes too broad. And so distress is oftentimes, or distress that might have once been treated as a part of ordinary life, ends up being pathologized or treated as a pathology. And so the worry goes with a related complaint, and that's that the diagnostic decision-making process oftentimes seems very, very arbitrary, and that socially relevant aspects or culturally relevant aspects are oftentimes treated as secondary as opposed to primary. And so if you guys have ever read the DSM or criteria for any type of disorder, you'll see that the DSM tries to address this issue, but it doesn't come with problems, obviously. But the two ways that I've noticed that it primarily tries to address this issue, it is firstly through its no better explanation principle. The idea is that in practice, clinicians are supposed to ask whether or not symptoms could be better explained by other things other than the disorder in question. So whether or not there might be a separate disorder that can explain the symptoms better, whether or not there are substance effects of other medication, whether or not there's a completely separate medical condition occurring, or, importantly, other contextually important normal responses to everyday life. And so, if someone presents with symptoms that may resemble, depression or anxiety or PTSD or whatever, the question is not only do they meet the criteria. By no means is a psychiatrist supposed to just, check these boxes. They need to ask, well, what else could account for this, and could it explain it better? So that's one way it tries to, the DSM at least, tries to safeguard itself from this boundary problem. The second is that of functional impairment. So a lot of diagnoses require that symptoms cause clinically significant distress or impairment to day-to-day life or day-to-day functioning. So it needs to interfere with work, relationship, tasks, just all that type of stuff. And the point here is to distinguish I'm suffering or I'm in distress to I'm suffering or in distress in a way that is becoming debilitating or disabling. And so obviously neither of these two safeguards will end this boundary problem debate. Well, why? Because, for example, the no better explanation, this gets very complicated by cases where life events and pathology become completely intertwined. So where it's no longer clear that it's a pathology exercising itself, or if it's the environment affecting you and then kind of feeding into this pathology. Instances for prolonged grief or chronic trauma, developmental adversity, or complex PTSD, right? All of these things where context starts to become almost inseparable from the symptom formation or symptom continuation. This idea of impairments also not very, or of functional impairments also not very immune, because, well, clearly some people can function under far higher levels of distress or of impairment than others. In the same way, some people could still drive home after 20 beers and not hit anyone. That doesn't mean that they're not impaired at all. So these safeguards that the DSM has put in place is kind of like they're trying to answer the issue, but they obviously don't do a 100% clean-cut job. The boundary problem persists, or at least this is what these papers are suggesting, and I'll put all of them down below. So the question is, essentially, what exactly makes something a disorder rather than a understandable reaction to day-to-day life or life experiences? One interesting figure comes in that's really big in this space, Boorse. Dr. Boorse, he says, maybe this boundary can be objective, and he introduces this biostatistical theory. And so his core move, or the main thrust of the argument of this, or the force of this model, let's say, is that he's saying that when people are talking about this, we're oftentimes conflating or mashing together diseases and illnesses, and he makes a clear distinction between these two things. He says, well, diseases, on one hand, they are purely biological. It's a biological matter. They're supposed to be value-free, right? So zero-value judgments are kind of imposed on this. And the other one, the illness, is one in which social context kind of matters. There's a social aspect to it. And so what the biostatistical theory, or the BST, essentially is, it's saying that like health is normal functioning, and then where normal, all it means is a statistical typical functioning within that given demographic. So within your rough sex, age, race, like all that type of thing, within like your general demographic placement, you look at the typical functioning, give it like being able to interact with friends, go to work, all this type of stuff. And if you're no longer near the mean, then there is some sort of unhealthy behavior or dysfunction occurring. And so what that implies for the boundary problem is that now all of a sudden, if he's right, then the boundary between disorder and non-disorder is no longer negotiable by like culture or politics or anything like that. But it's more so centered around, what the function of a mechanism is. So whether that's going to work or how many times you smile a day, and whether it's performing whether it's performing at its statistical mean given your reference class. And so now all of a sudden, the boundary problem becomes this identity dysfunction, almost. And within that are baked the psychological mechanisms. And so obviously this also comes with objections, and he's not free from them. Critics kind of press that these reference classes, or these demographic classes that you might group people under, oftentimes they can smuggle in these normative ideals or normative choices. And then this statistical normality can label rare but benign traits as pathological. So say you're like someone who absolutely loves collecting coins, now all of a sudden that's a awkward or different behavior just because it's very statistically different. Anyways, that was the issue at hand, this boundary problem. Nothing more I could do with it other than make a video, so hopefully you guys thought about it. Papers are down there if you want to read more. Hopefully I didn't butcher these interpretations. And sorry for not recording the book club properly. This is what you get instead.